Hey, happy Tuesday or Wednesday, everybody. This is going to be our last set of notes for this week, talking about World War One, focusing still on the First World War here. Like I said, we'll get to the Russian Revolution next week, but today we're going to get into the fighting and the war itself. So we're going to focus on major battles, some other key aspects of the war. Okay. Now, like I told you in our Zoom conference earlier, and I said in class or in previous notes here. This was a really, really bad war. The United States, we tend to think more of World War II because we were more heavily involved in that. But in World War One was much worse in the sense of battlefield losses. When you stack up all the casualties from World War One and Two, people say there's more in World War Two because you include, the 11 million people that were killed in the Holocaust, um, as well as the more than 20 million that Stalin killed in the Soviet Union when he was going after people there. But pretty much all the casualties that you see from World War One are those that were killed fighting and in battle and in this war and where nothing is gained from either side. So we're going to highlight a few of the significant battles here and kind of go into some of those details. And in particular, I'm going to give you the casualty numbers from these battles, and I really want you to know this because that's something that needs to kind of stick out for you. Okay. Uh, so the first battle of the Marne, you'll notice that a lot of the battles also have a first, a second, a third, because so little ground is gained that they end up fighting pretty much at the same spot where the fighting had taken place before. The first battle of the Marne is noteworthy because it's really the first significant battle of the war. This is where I told you when the Schlieffen Plan failed, when the French met the Germans, when the French went out and met the Germans at at Marne and stopped the German advance. And what followed was a long war of attrition. So this battle lasted in about the month of September 1914. And it's important to note because it halted the German advance. The French here halted the German advance. And in total, just in a month's worth of fighting, the First Battle of the Marne claimed about 250,000 casualties. About 250,000 casualties. Think about that, right? Um, you know, for comparison's sake, the entire American Revolution claimed about 30,000 casualties. Okay, so we're talking war at a scale that we've never seen before. One of the funny stories about the First Battle of the Marne was um, Paris so quickly responded when they got notes or they got word that Germany was invading that they sent troops out in taxi cabs. They sent everybody out in the regular military, but to get more troops out faster to the battle lines to meet the Germans, they would send soldiers out in taxi cabs to the field of battle. So that's how crazy the preparation was. You imagine, you're a cab driver and some guy, a couple guys get in the cab and they're like, "Where are you going?" "Well, we're going to the war," right? "Yeah, you should take us to the war. We'll give you a nice tip after you get shot at and killed." So pretty crazy. Another significant battle of World War II was the Second Battle of the Ypres. Now, this was in May 1915. Uh, in total, the casualties are low. It's about 104,000 casualties. So again, first Marne is 250,000. Second Ypres is about 104,000. But this battle stands out because, and I think we mentioned in class when we were talking about the war, uh, all these new technologies were used for the first time in World War One. And the most devastating of these technologies potentially could be chemical warfare. And chemical warfare, of course, is used for the first time in the First World War. And it's at the Second Battle of the Ypres and where it's used for the first time. Um, Mustard gas, chlorine gas, blister glass, nerve gas. Uh, they were meant to, in lesser cases, debilitate soldiers so they'd be easier targets. In other cases, they could kill you within 30 seconds, 15, 30 seconds if you didn't, if you don't take the necessary action quick enough, which would often involve sticking yourself in the chest with a syringe to stop the gas from getting to your nervous system, which would cause your nervous system to seize up and then would kill you seconds later. So it's pretty awful. Mustard gas would oftentimes would cause soldiers to get a lot of internal problems with breathing and would lead to many dying in the decades afterwards. But the first usage, interestingly enough, it was by the Germans. The first usage at the Second Battle of Ypres of gas, the Germans would fire these canisters from these big howitzers or big guns, presumably to the other side. But unfortunately, they miscalculated the wind gusts. So when they first fired those first canisters of this nerve gas, it actually got blown back on the German soldiers, which I guess it's one of those cases of that's what you get for doing that. We'll talk more about gases later on. Another significant battle, one of the longest battles of the war, was the Battle of Verdun. This lasts from February to July 1916, so right about in the middle of the war. In the Battle of Verdun, there were about 984,000 casualties, a little bit less than a million. Okay, 984,000 casualties. Again, this is another battle where both sides fight back and forth and very little is gained. The French claim a victory. Was it really a victory? Probably not. With hundreds of thousands dead, there's not much that you can say. There's not much that you can say positive about that. As soon as the Battle of Verdun ends, we have the First Battle of the Somme. Yeah, and this is another battle that lasts 5-6 months, from July to November of 1916. And this was also the deadliest single battle of the war. In total, at the Battle of the Somme, there were 1.2 million casualties at one battle. 1.2 million casualties. By comparison, most estimates say that in the American Civil War, in the total of the 4-year war, America lost about 700,000 soldiers. There are about 700,000 casualties in the entire American Civil War. In the First Battle of the Somme alone, we're talking 1.2 million casualties between the two sides. The first day alone, the first day of the battle, 58,000 soldiers were killed in one day. 58,000 soldiers were killed in one day. That's insanity. And unfortunately, it didn't get much better after that. Moving forward to closer to the end of the war, the Second Battle of the Marne, July and August of 1918. This stands out for a couple reasons. This is the first battle that the United States was involved in. Right? This is the first battle of the United States. We didn't actually get the war ended in November of 1918. The United States first put soldiers into fighting after we had mobilized and sent them over there. We started fighting in about March or April of 1918, and or started, so so this is the first major battle that the United States was involved in. In total, the Second Battle of the Marne had about 300,000 casualties. 300,000 casualties, and it was a turning point in the war. It represented Germany. The Central Powers represented Germany's last major offensive in the war, the last time they're actually trying to move forward and gain ground. And it proved to be, for the first time in a while, that we've seen any battle in this war have any sort of decisive victory. Notice I'm not telling you who's winning these battles here, and that's for good reason, because nobody's winning them. They're wars of attrition, and nobody wins in those circumstances. This is an Allied victory, and shortly afterward, the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, or the Battle of the Ardennes Forest, which happens over the course of a couple months, is the last major battle of the war, and of course results in the end of the war and in a victory for the Allies at great cost. I said before the United States was involved in the war for about 9 months, 8 or 9 months total. In those 8 or 9 months, we lost 100,000 soldiers. We sent 1 million there total. We lost about 100,000, which is only 10%, which is a lot better than most of the other countries. But compared with World War II, in the entire 4 year almost fighting in World War II, the United States lost about 356,000 soldiers in the total of the war. In about 6 to 9 months fighting in World War I, the United States loses about a third of that in much, much less time. The Battle of the Meuse Argonne alone, there was about a total of 310,000 casualties. Not in vain, though, as it is representative of the end of the war and ultimately a victory for the Allies and a defeat for Germany. Okay, lots of casualties. If you were a soldier that fought in the First World War and you made it home from the war unscathed, without injury or without any sort of anything happening to you, probably many people in Europe would think that you're a coward because nobody, figuratively speaking, not literally, nobody came home from that war not injured in some way. Whether you had internal lung problems because of gas you may have ingested, rather you got trench foot by spending so much time in the trenches in the wars that would cause gangrene and problems like that. Amputations were super high. So you saw it wasn't uncommon to see somebody walking down the street, if you're in London in the 1920s, to see somebody walking down the street with one arm or one leg or something like that. And on top of that, the mental trauma that would come from soldiers having fought in this conflict. So you weren't going to come home from the First World War unscathed or uninjured in some way. Let's throw a few new terms out at you that were kind of created as a result of World War I. One of these terms is brinkmanship. This was a common term during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Brinkmanship is where you basically push your opponent to the limit. You threaten to go to war to achieve your military goals. If you don't do this, we will go to war with you. If you don't do that, we will send our military. Pushing to the brink. Sometimes that spills over to war, sometimes it doesn't. The Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States, or the whole Cold War in of itself between the United States and the Soviet Union, were examples of brinkmanship. We know we have better weapons, we have bigger bombs, we'll drop them on the Soviet Union thinks their weapons are better, so on and so forth. This practice was first brought during the First World War. Conscription is another thing that was common during World War I, not just in the United States, but in countries throughout Europe. It's a military draft where you're legally forcing people to join the military. The United States had done this in the American Civil War, but only a little bit. You're in the middle of the war and you need soldiers to fight. And a draft sometimes is the only way to do that. We never really needed one in human history before this. But because so many people were dying and or were being injured in a way that they wouldn't be able to return to the battlefield, we had no choice but to, and when I say we, I'm talking about countries in Europe, the United States, and others, we had no choice but to draft soldiers into military service, to keep the fight going until the war was over. Mobilization is another term that comes out of the war. It's kind of like militarism, but mobilization is a process. It's a process of assembling troops and supplies to be ready for war. When you go to war, you don't do it overnight. There's a mobilization process that sometimes can take up to 2 months. The United States, for instance, entered World War I in the middle of 1917, but we weren't able to mobilize till early 1918 and actually get troops over to Europe. It takes time to make weapons and ammunition and other things that you need. It takes time to get soldiers together and get them trained, to make new ships and planes now because we're using those in war, bombs, tanks, other things for the process of war. Mobilization is a big key point, is a big key part of war, and it is still today. And the country that's able to mobilize most quickly is usually going to be most prepared for war. Propaganda is another term. This is where saying negative things about your opponents, creating rumors, usually some things that aren't necessarily completely false, but where the truth is stretched a little bit. Propaganda is a key aspect in World War I to gain support for the war effort on both sides. For the U.S. side, Uncle Sam is a popular example, and also to point out negativity about Germans and the Kaiser, the person in charge of Germany, and things of that nature. So that's a big part of it too. All right, so what are some of the outcomes of World War I? Well, Germany, even though, if you remember, Germany didn't start the war. I think, I know Jacob started it in one class when he got killed as the archbishop, and I forget who started it in the other class. It was Zach when he shot the archduke, which wasn't very nice. So anyway, Germany didn't start the war, but they're the bad guys, and they're the ones that are held chiefly responsible. Something of this is that Germany was kind of forced to sign was something called the War Guilt Clause. Write that down. War Guilt Clause. And this essentially said that was this new law between countries that basically said that if you're responsible for starting the conflict, you have to be responsible for taking care of things afterwards, meaning war reparations. And Germany, being the country held responsible for the war and being the most powerful economic and military country involved in the war, is forced to kind of pay for it. The war officially ends on November 11th, 1918. Interestingly enough, the treaty was signed on November 11th at 11:11 a.m. This is why the time 11:11 people say make a wish, because good fortune or good things are supposed to happen at 11:11 a.m. in particular on November 11th. This, of course, in the United States now is when we celebrate Veterans Day. In Europe, they call it Armistice Day because it's the end of the war to end all wars. It's the end of the First World War. Casualties. Now, I gave you some numbers from single battles, and probably what I told you added up to maybe about 3 million casualties. In total, from the war, where nonstop fighting was happening over the course of 4 years, we see about 10 million soldiers get killed in the war, and as many as another 20 to 30 million wounded. So that's a total, folks, of 40 million casualties. 40 million casualties in this war. Populations in Europe are decimated. Economies in Europe are decimated. The United States, because we weren't involved so long and none of the fighting took place here, we actually didn't have that many ill effects from World War I. But we saw in the United States how bad off Europe was, and because of that, we wanted to limit our involvement with this part of the world, with that part of the world, as much as possible in the 1920s, because how bad things. Now, at the end, the two sides get together and sign what's known as the Treaty of Versailles. So, Treaty of Versailles has a few important things that come out of it. Okay, on the final treaty to deal with everything is signed on June 28th, 1919. So it took several months, and of course they meet in Paris because that's what they do. Germany wasn't even invited to the meeting, even though Germany was going to be held accountable for everything. It's pretty much a meeting between the big three: Great Britain, France, the United States, and Italy was there too, but they don't do anything, so whatever. It established that 9 new nations would be developed as a result of the treaty. These new nations included, and I want you to write these down, Austria and Hungary would be split into 2 separate countries. Uh, Czechoslovakia was created as another new country. Czechoslovakia, uh, Yugoslavia, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. These are the Lithuanian states up, the Baltic states up near where Russia was, and Poland. So all these new countries created as a result of the um, Treaty of Versailles. Again, Austria, Hungary are now made two separate countries. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland. So it drastically changes the geography, the political geography of Europe, and ultimately is going to play a big role in what leads us to the Second World War 20 years later. Great Britain and France split up the Ottoman Empire between themselves. They rename it Turkey and formed colonies there. So there again, even though imperialism was a big cause of this war, they're still trying to push imperialistic goals. And on the other end, Germany was banned from having an army and was forced to pay $33 billion, $33 billion in war reparations. That's a lot of money today, and it's a ton of money back then. Germany's economy was destroyed, Germany's land and infrastructure was destroyed, and now they have to pay all of these countries back, because they're held chiefly responsible for the war because of the war guilt clause. No way they're going to be able to pay it back. And then when we talk about World War II, we'll see how devastating this was to the economy of Germany during the 1920s. So again, at the outset of the war, this is what the map of Europe kind of looks like in 1914. Okay, you see there's no Finland. Russia's very big. There's not as many countries. Austria-Hungary is big, and Germany, etc. By 1924, so you see you got the Baltic states up here, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Poland is new. Czechoslovakia, Austria and Hungary are much smaller, and they've separated into two countries. Yugoslavia is another country. Germany has been weakened and is significantly smaller. Obviously, Russia is now the Soviet Union. You've got your Baltic states up here. You got Finland. So big changes. The Ottoman Empire is now Turkey, and all these folks have their own freedom now, I guess. So you've seen a lot of big changes in that geography in a short period of time. And we'll stop there, and we'll continue next Sunday night, next Sunday afternoon. I'll send you your next set of notes. And of course, we'll talk about this stuff again on Thursday. All right, folks, I know this is kind of a long one, so we'll let you go there. See everybody Thursday. Bye.